Finuala Dowling. I've chosen to talk about novellas and books that are quick to read because I love brevity, and I think writers are at their best when they are succinct. Some people try to define a novella by word count as a novel of between 20 and 40,000 words. Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, defines it as a work that is shorter than a novel and longer than a short story. I agree with this looser definition. To me, a novella is a book that can be read in a couple of sittings, a book ideally under 200 pages in length. And to cover myself against word count and page count pedants, I've called this lecture Novellas and Quick Reads. A contemporary practitioner of the novella genre, Ian McCallum, wrote an essay for the New Yorker magazine called Some Notes on the Novella, and in it he defended the genre for its tight dramatic form. He described the novella as the perfect form of prose fiction. It is the beautiful daughter of a rambling, bloated, ill-shaven giant, but a giant who's a genius on his best days. From a publishing point of view, the novella is an awkward proposition. Publishers worry about, they have this kind of absurd anxiety about whether the book buyer is getting their money's worth, as if we bought novels by the kilogram. And when Ian McCallum's own novella On Chesil Beach was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, it caused some raised eyebrows, as if to say, what's such a short book doing on the short list? And I just can't believe that anyone would think that a 500-page book is better than a 200-page book simply because it is longer. For me, the art of writing is largely the art of cutting down. The other 9 excellent books I'll cover today will be less well known than The Uncommon Reader by Alan Bennett. But I wanted to start with this delightful comic novella because in its 121 pages, it says so much about the experience of reading and how reading transforms us. The Uncommon Reader was first published 15 years ago in the London Review of Books, to which Bennett is a regular contributor. It was immediately taken up by Faber. The novella wonders what would happen if the Queen of England suddenly became a voracious reader, the uncommon reader of the title. What if, instead of asking, "Have you traveled far?" she asked her subjects, "What are you reading?" Everyone, from her private secretary to the President of France, is disconcerted. Bennett sets up his delightful conceit in a fun way. One day, the Queen follows her barking corgis round the side of Buckingham House, not a part of the palace she generally saw, where she finds a City of Westminster travelling library. When she first picks up a book, it is out of politeness. She apologizes for the disturbance caused by her dogs and, not wanting to give offense, borrows a book by Ivy Compton Burnett. She remembers this author, she remembers giving this author a Dame of the British Empire award. Ivy Compton Burnett is perhaps not the ideal choice for someone not used to reading to begin with. But the Queen finishes the book because one has learned to finish whatever one starts. Luckily, on her second visit, the Queen discovers The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. And if you've read that book, you'll agree it's an ideal introductory novel for someone not yet in the habit of regular reading. The Uncommon Reader is not just an opportunity for Bennett to make fun of the royal household. It's a wonderful portrait of a reader, how fast one book leads to another, how books offer us sustenance and escape, how we can't help recommending books to others, how we start lists of books we intend to read, and how through reading we join a commonwealth of equals. Reading tends to distract us from our nearest and dearest, who may feel neglected and resentful. And so in funny scenes in The Uncommon Reader, the Queen's corgis chew up copies of Ian McCallum and A.S. Byatt. But new friends are also made. she discovers, she meets a bibliophile who works in the kitchen, and she soon promotes him to footman so that he can be around her to advise her on her reading. Bennett uses this light, quick read to make quite a profound point, that readers are naturally thinkers, subversives, rebels, questioners, not ideal Queen material. In one funny moment, the Queen's security detail finds a copy of an Anita Bruckner novel in the royal coach and blows it up. I mean, Anita Bruckner, the polar opposite of a threat. There's a wonderful twist to the tale at the end, as Bennett reveals that, of course, voracious reading can only lead to one outcome. And you'll have to find that out by reading the book yourself. If you haven't read Alan Bennett before, I'd urge you to catch up with him by reading Untold Stories and The Lady in the Van, both of which are memoirs, and they're also available in audiobooks, so you can drive long distances listening to his engaging Yorkshire accent. I would place The Uncommon Reader alongside three other favorite novels about bibliophiles: Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress, 84 Charing Cross Road, and The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai Siji was first published in French 20 years ago, and it's the semi-autobiographical tale set during China's Cultural Revolution, when children of intellectuals like Dai Siji were sent off for re-education in peasant labor camps. Two boys, sons of doctors, are sent to a farming village near Tibet. They fall in love with the local tailor's daughter, and she tells them that another boy, also being re-educated, has a suitcase of classic books hidden away. The boys delight in that suitcase, which includes Balzac, and also tell stories of now banned films and books to the absolutely besotted, amazed, and engaged Chinese peasants. I'm, completely proving that there's nothing that propaganda or banning books can do to put out the fire of books in our hearts. There's something about books and bookshops and their relationship to films. Dai Siji's Little Chinese Seamstress was made into a film, and so was Penelope Fitzgerald's The Bookshop.
When we read a story, we inhabit it. She, more than anything else in the world, loved the moment when you finished a book and the story keeps playing like the most vivid dream in your head.
You live on your own, don't you? You've just moved into the old house.
Yes, I'm the one opening the little bookshop.
Many of us are not at all convinced by the sudden transformation of the old house into a shop. You do understand, don't you?
Dear madam, no one has plucked up courage enough to sell books in this forsaken coin of the world.
My first customer. He so jealously guards his privacy after the tragic death of his beloved wife.
You can't learn this place by yourself.
You don't really look old enough. Or strong enough.
You look old, but you don't look strong.
Things have taken quite a dip in your business of late, haven't they?
She was a very powerful woman. Does that not concern you?
No.
Many of us believe it should be a local art centre.
She wants to get rid of you and she won't stop.
She can't do that. It's my bookshop. It's my home.
It's fascinating, the love affair that movies have with bookshops. I mean, I wish I could devote a whole lecture just to this subject. I wonder if it's because a bookshop is an ideal meeting place. It is both absolutely sensual. You saw Emily Mortimer smelling books, stroking the frontispieces of books. So it's sensual on the one hand. It's also a thoroughly intellectual space. So in other words, a bookshop is somehow a body and mind experience. I think bookshops are also these enclosed spaces rich with possibilities for establishing a character immediately. Well, you can tell who the character is by which section you find them in. And there are certainly more bookshops in movies than there are movies in books. Oh, I don't want to do that. An Imaginary Life by David Malouf is an extraordinary novella. It's about the Roman poet Ovid's exile in Tomis, what is now Constanta in Romania. And you can see this is the artist Turner's depiction of Ovid's departure into exile, complete with sunset, and in the foreground there's actually a burial site, even though Ovid hasn't died, but I suppose leaving Rome is a death. The reason for Ovid's exile remain mysterious, but could have something to do with the Emperor Augustus not wanting to be associated with a dirty-minded poet. And you'll see that quote up there. In one of his exile poems, Ovid attributed his banishment to two offenses: a poem and a mistake have destroyed me. We just go back to the cover. In Malouf's novel, the highly cultured author of the Metamorphoses finds himself trapped among what seems to him to be a barbaric tribe of people who know nothing of his beloved Latin language or his art. They are his captors, but there's no need to lock him up, because to escape in such a hostile landscape would mean certain death. Ovid has flashbacks to his childhood encounters with a wild boy. Now, as an adult in a desolate, inhospitable place on the outskirts of civilization, he hears talk of a wild boy who is said to run with the wolves. He makes it his mission to capture the feral child. This photograph I'm showing you is by Julia Fullerton Batten. And if you can look her up, you'll see her remarkable series of 15 photographed scenes that recapture the true stories of 15 different feral children. What I loved about An Imaginary Life was its beautiful style, its wonderful exploration of metamorphosis, and the absolutely compelling bond of grudging trust that develops between one of the tribe's elders and Ovid. Malouf captures Ovid's gradual appreciation of a culture he had originally found barbaric. There is an utterly superb scene where the poet, who buried his father with customary cold Roman rites years ago, is urged to join in the tribe's much more exuberant, expressive, primitive rituals. He rides among the skeletons, casting grain, whooping and yelling at even evil spirits, and finally feels free of his dead father and ready to prepare for his own death. I'm actually surprised that Malouf wrote this book when he was young, because in many ways it is an old man's book. I was also completely riveted by the entrapment and training of the wild boy, especially the exquisite moment when the child, thinking he is unobserved, reaches for Ovid's ink and parchment. The novel is deeply engaged with language as something that both binds and excludes people. Language is something so difficult and yet so rewarding to learn. Language is a medium of expression central to a poet's identity, so much so that to remove it is torture. Australian reviewers at the time found the book artful rather than convincing, and seemed overly aware of the shaming parallels with Australia's history of enforced acculturation of Indigenous children. For me, the book stands as an extraordinary literary achievement, as gripping as a story and as lyrical as a poem. And I wondered if the slightly standoffish reception he received for it was because the book was only his second novel. And reviewers are notoriously tough on second novels. They love to say, well, he didn't meet up to his initial promise. And also because Malouf was yet to become the great luminary you know, even on a postage stamp, the great luminary of Australian writing. Or maybe it was because if you're an author from the former colonies, you're not expected or really allowed to depict settings from elsewhere. Just to give you a sense of Malouf's style and the, sorry, that's not there, where is it? Is this quote. Just to give you a sense of Malouf's style and the powerful, deeper meaning he conveys, I wanted to read you this extract. This is the real metamorphosis. Our further selves are contained within us, as the leaves and blossoms are in the tree. We have only to find the spring and release it. Such changes are slow beyond the imagination. They take generations, but it works, this process. So the theme of metamorphosis runs beautifully through the whole book. I felt like I understood it for the first time. And reading this extract perhaps also explains why David Malouf's novels have never been made into films. As he himself said, they're all interior. You can't translate that to the screen. Almost nothing happens. Another novel about a poet is The Quickening Maze. So this isn't one of my choices for the lecture today. It's just an additional side interest to Malouf's book on Ovid. The Quickening Maze is a fictional account of the Northamptonshire peasant poet John Clare, who spent 4 years in High Beach private asylum. John Clare was admitted there after struggling with alcohol, critical neglect, and depression. Scholars have wondered whether John Clare ever met Tennyson, whose brother Septimus was also treated at High Beach Asylum. Adam Folds deals with that mystery in just the right way, I think, in what is for me a very sympathetic portrait of a stubbornly original poet. Claire Keegan burst onto the literary stage in 2010 with her story Foster, which she had submitted for the Davy Byrne Irish Writing Award. The competition was judged by novelist Richard Ford, whom you may know, and Keegan won the competition. An abridged version of the story was published in The New Yorker, and then Faber published the 88-page full-length version. Keegan describes Foster as a long, short story, not a novella, because she says it doesn't have the pace of a novella. Well, I wonder about that. The book has a richness and an emotional depth that make it satisfying to read as a novel. Yes, it does have the dramatic ending of a short story, but the novella form is deeply connected to drama in its own way. When Keegan described to an interviewer how the story came about, she said that it wasn't a storyline that came to her, but an image. An image haunted her, and the image was a well, a bucket, and a girl's reflection in the water. The image nagged at her until she began writing. Foster is narrated from the point of view of a young Irish girl from a large cash-strapped family who is fostered to a more prosperous childless couple for the summer months. She arrives dirty, ill-fed, a bedwetter who is struggling to read and who has had almost no exposure to parental concern or tenderness in her life. Both literally and figuratively, she grows under the Kinsella's care. The food that nourishes her is lovingly described, and if you love food descriptions in books as much as I do, you'll swoon for the rhubarb tart and cream of her first meal with the Kinsellas. Like the girl's parents, the Kinsellas are a farming couple, but unlike her parents, they are industrious and do not drink or gamble their livestock away. Because it's told from the girl's point of view, Foster is exquisitely simple and innocent in its style. The reader gathers indirectly that some tragedy has befallen the Kinsellas and that the little girl is in some sense a surrogate for a loss. The reader also senses that the girl's harried mother and dissolute father bring something with them that is worse than poverty. No wonder the girl thinks, I drink 6 measures of water and wish for now that this place without shame or secrets could be my home. The secrets of the foster couple and the tensions in the girl's birth family eventually come together in an extraordinary dramatic final scene. The book brought Keegan fame, and she is now ranked amongst Ireland's finest writers. People are now turning to her backlist, which includes the story collections Antarctica and Walk the Blue Fields. Just thinking about the wonder of this book and its rendition of a childhood idyll makes me think of a book Kate spoke about, I think, a few years ago, Tove Jansson's The Summer Book. The Finnish writer Tove Jansson is loved and known for her children's books about the Moomin family, but her novel for adults, The Summer Book, is it's just absolutely exquisite. It features the adventures and philosophical conversations of an artistic grandmother and her granddaughter. A favourite Irish writer of mine to whom Claire Keegan has been compared is William Trevor. Reading Turgenev begins with a woman being released after 30 years spent in an asylum. Mary Louise is disappointed when the man who has come to fetch her is not who she expected or hoped for. "I thought you might be Incestuous," she says, in a reference to the hero of one of Turgenev's novels. You have to read to the end of the novella to discover the real significance of Turgenev, but suffices to say that one of the underlying messages of the book is that reading can be an awakening. Shared reading can bring a couple together. This novella tells the story of 2 relationships. First, an unsatisfying marriage of convenience, and second, an absorbing but tragic romance. The book sets these 2 relationships up against each other almost as a lesson in feeling for us. The one, dreary, routine, lonely, stodgy, full of resentment, and the other, free, spontaneous, transporting, fulfilling, at once illicit and utterly innocent. The time frame of the novel switches between 1955, the year of Mary Louise's marriage to the older draper, Elmer Quarry, and 1985, the year of her release. At that time, Ireland was, like the rest of the world, a little bit later than the rest of the world, taking a more enlightened approach to asylums and mental health care. This elasticity of time allows William Trevor to encapsulate the changes that have taken place in one individual and in Ireland over a 30-year period. Reading Turgenev is romantic and tragic, a subtle study of place, time, and character. It's not Mary Louise's husband who is the villain. He's as much a victim as she is. Nor really are his 2 aggrieved and sometimes openly nasty sisters. The real villain in the novella is passivity about one's fate. Trevor shows how unhappiness is a trap that we make for ourselves by numbing ourselves with drink or depressive behavior. When we are happy, by contrast, we are the opposite of numb. Curious, aware, our cheeks flush, we take an interest in our surroundings. We don't just go through the motions of life's dull routines, putting up with it. We live in and savor the moment, and that moment of true happiness, no matter how brief, can feed us for years. I would recommend 2 other books by William Trevor. The Story of Lucy Galt. Oh my word, I don't think I'll ever forget this book. It's about a beloved only child who goes missing and is presumed dead, sending her distressed parents off on a futile European tour that is meant to distract them from their grief, but has the opposite effect. It's brilliant. I can't recommend it highly enough. It was shortlisted for the Booker and the Whitbread prizes. And then to the book that introduced me to William Trevor's fiction, The Hill Bachelors, a short story collection. And it's wonderful how these Irish short story writers don't just bung in any stories into a collection. The whole story has a kind of unified theme. A reviewer in the Wall Street Journal said of Trevor, There is no better short story writer in the English-speaking world. William Trevor sadly died in 2016. Let's come back to our own continent. So Long a Letter is an 80-page autobiographical novel by Senegalese writer Mariama Ba. Translated from the French, it takes the form of a long letter from a woman who has just been widowed to her childhood friend who has just been divorced. From the first page, and especially as Ramatoulaye describes her husband's burial rites, we are thrown into the fascinating world of Islam as practiced in Senegal. We immediately realize that the widow is not alone. She is mourning alongside a co-wife. 5 years previously, her husband married a school friend of their daughters. This is hard for Ramatoulaye, who was married to Modou for 30 years. She describes her husband's funeral rites meticulously and provides a fascinating insight into Senegalese culture. For example, there is something called a mirasse, in which all the dead man's secret sins are revealed, even his crooked property dealings, the lavish gifts bestowed on the second wife and her family, while the first wife and her family are left in debt. Very unlike Western culture's rule about not speaking ill of the dead. For Ramatoulaye, her husband's death is an occasion to review her own life as well as her friends, their childhood, education, and how they fell in love. In some ways, the book is an eye-opener, revealing a fascinating foreign world. On the other hand, it is universal and familiar. The story of a long marriage, difficulty with one's in-laws, and the pain and jealousy and resentment involved in being usurped by a younger woman. Mariama Ba, who was born in 1929 and died young in 1981, was, like her narrator, both a devout Muslim and a feminist, a school teacher passionate about the education of girls. And the book's strength lies in this paradox. We completely believe Ramatoulaye's faith, the consolation she gets from the Quran, and her feeling of betrayal when her husband exercises his right to take a second wife. So I'm just going to give you an example from the book. Alone, I live in a monotony broken only by purifying baths, the changing of my mourning clothes every Monday and Friday. I hope to carry out my duties fully. My heart concurs with the demands of religion. Reared since childhood on their strict precepts, I expect not to fail. The walls that limit my horizon for 4 months and 10 days do not bother me. I have enough memories in me to ruminate upon, and these are what I am afraid of, for they smack of bitterness. The book has stayed with me over the years since I first read it. It is a pure outpouring from the heart, tender, human, and compelling. It has been voted one of the best books from Africa, the 100 best books from Africa. So as I said, Mariama Ba died in her early 50s, so it's perhaps not surprising that she left only 2 works of fiction behind. The other one is called Scarlet Song, and it covers very much the same thing, what it is like for a woman to find herself in a polygamous marriage. Ever since my school days, reading Fanny Burney's Evelina and my early varsity days reading Les Liaisons Dangereuses, I have loved epistolary novels like Mariama Ba's So Long a Letter. The one I'm reading right now, Address Unknown, which takes the form of an intermittent correspondence between 2 German men, one a Jew now living in America and the other returned to Berlin, was first published in 1938. It's by Kellerman Taylor. Well, that's what it says on the cover. Her real first name was Catherine, but her husband felt the subject matter was too strong to be published under a woman's name. This book is currently undergoing a revival and rediscovery, so there will be new editions available. It's been praised for the way it touches the heart of Nazi darkness in just a few pages. A read, Amazon tells me, that will take you as long as a short bus ride. The Pilgrim Hawk by Glenway Westcott is another memorable book on the theme of marriage. I read this book as if it were a play because it has so many theatrical elements. The action takes place in a single afternoon in a country house outside Paris in about 1928, 1929, with servants downstairs and the idle rich upstairs amusing themselves with alcohol and conversation. The narrator is an American expat who has come to visit the wealthy Alexandra, whom he rather fancies. Another couple arrives, the Cullens. Mrs. Cullen brings with her her Pilgrim Hawk, Lucy. The hawk, its movements, its needs, its strangeness within an inside room becomes the obsessive focus, not just of Mrs. Cullen and the others present, but of us, the readers. The bird has little fits as it tries to regain its freedom, but then submits again as Mrs. Cullen caresses it. The reader and the lunch party are enthralled by Lucy, the hawk. Her hunger, her frustration, her elegance, her restiveness, her hypnotic presence. All afternoon, a wonderful, explosive tension builds, partly because of the amount of alcohol the narrator is pouring for everybody. In fact, I need to go and find that scene and copy it out, because the way the narrator mixes and pours the alcohol while thinking horrible thoughts about the people who are drinking it is just wonderful. Anyway, so this tension builds while all this drink is being consumed, and while downstairs a dinner of freshly butchered pigeon is being prepared. And the tension also builds because we are transfixed by the Cullens as a couple. Are they devoted, or do they loathe each other? And will they ever leave? They do eventually. And in their departure lies a very dramatic and satisfying denouement that also involves the servants. The subtitle of the book, A Love Story, is at once ironic and murderously sincere. Because Westcott is clearly using the hawk as a symbol of marriage and obsessive love, I wanted to share this quote with you. There is not as much sweet safety in marriage as one hopes. Hunger and its twin, disgust, are in it too. Need and greed, and passage of time, the punishment. It's interesting that such a deep analysis of marriage should come from a writer who never married. But I think Westcott was drawing on his observations of his parents and grandparents. Westcott grew up in the American Midwest, and he covered his childhood in his early novels, notably The Grandmothers, which, from what I can see on the internet, is mostly enjoyed by other people who grew up in the American Midwest. Westcott met his partner, Munro Wheeler, when he was still a teenager. So that was certainly a very long time the two of them lived together. The couple moved to France, where they mixed in the circle that included Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway. In fact, Hemingway caricatured Westcott as a slightly affected novelist who irritates the narrator in The Sun Also Rises. Westcott's literary connections and reflections on life as a gay man can be found in his journals, especially the last volume, A Heaven of Words. But in his fiction, he remained, as Edmund White observed, closeted. White had met Westcott and described him as intolerably urbane and amiable. Despite his long life, Westcott did not publish a great deal of fiction. The only other novel of his that I see mentioned out and about is Apartment in Athens, about the Nazi occupation of Greece. But almost everyone agrees that The Pilgrim Hawk was his masterpiece. In fact, Michael Cunningham, in a recent introduction to a reissue of the novel, compared The Pilgrim Hawk to The Great Gatsby and The Aspern Papers. The author Robin Morn is also something of a one-trick pony as far as his fiction is concerned. Though, of course, being the nephew of the more famous Maugham, Somerset. His memoirs are still in circulation. I found this ultra-slim hardback on my parents' shelves when I was young. I was attracted by its slenderness and its strangely decadent cover, and devoured it whole. I found The Servant shocking, disturbing, and absolutely entrancing. So I recently reread it to try and see whether my feelings had changed, but all these years later, it hasn't lost any of its haunting, appalling, and gripping impact. The novel's great strength, I think, is that it tells the story of a moral collapse from the point of view of an innocent party. The narrator, Richard, meets up in London with his old friend Tony, who has just returned from the war and is studying law. Tony has a new servant called Barrett, who seems at first to be perfect, an excellent chef, a housekeeper capable of intuiting Tony's every need. But Barrett has his own agenda and warped history. He gains an insidious power over his employer. Barrett creeps up on Tony as stealthily as the narrative itself creeps up on us. The novel manages to suggest unspeakable illicit acts without ever being explicit. In The Servant, Robin Maugham captures the post-war period and the difficulty men exposed to the war had in settling down afterwards. He himself fought in the Western Desert Campaign with the 8th Army, was wounded and mentioned in dispatches. Apart from being very perspicacious in its understanding of post-war masculinity, The Servant is also particularly attentive to the dissolving sexual and class taboos of the late 1940s. Recent editions come with an introduction by Robin Maugham's lover, William Lawrence, who notes a few intriguing parallels with Maugham's own life, such as a dependence on servants. The family had 12 when Robin Maugham was a child, and the fact that he actually once had a servant called Barrett. According to him, Maugham suffered from dissociative identity disorder and had done so since childhood. He had a naughty alter ego called Tommy. Maugham told him that if he hadn't had this mental disorder, he might never have written. Robin Maugham, as I said, was the nephew of Somerset Maugham and claimed in his autobiography that his uncle was one of the 3 shadows he lived under, including the legacy of his Lord Chancellor father and his own homosexuality. In The Servant, he equals his uncle in the way that he manages, in the space of only 62 pages, to create a sense of gradually unfolding descent into moral and physical lassitude. In that sense, and also because of the coded homosexuality underlying the apparently heterosexual relationships within it, I would put The Servant in the class of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Although Robin Maugham was warned by the film censor that the subject matter of The Servant was too immoral to be made into a film, after 10 years, the public's attitude had changed and he sold the film rights. It was made into a film in 1963 with a screenplay by Harold Pinter. I thought you might enjoy Robin Maugham's comment. I never liked Harold Pinter's screenplay of my novel, The Servant. The orgy scene at the end of the film was a cock-up. It was obvious to anyone that neither Pinter or director Joe Losey had ever been to one. Well, despite this rather disparaging comment, the film won 2 awards for Best Cinematography. Dirk Bogarde won a BAFTA for Best Actor. James Fox won a BAFTA for the Most Promising Newcomer. And Harold Pinter won 2 awards for Best Screenplay. In his lifetime, Robin Maugham didn't write about his uncle. In fact, well, some people describe it as a bribe. Other people say that Somerset Maugham found out how much his nephew was being offered to write a biography of him, and simply gave him that money in cash to dissuade him from writing it. Other people say Robin Morm actually bribed his uncle. But from what I understand, they had quite a cordial relationship. Once his uncle had died, he did publish Somerset and All the Morms and Conversations with Willie. But you know, if I'm wanting to read about the Morm family, I would rather read Selina Hastings' absolutely, as William Boyd says, superb The Secret Lives of Somerset Maugham. What an astonishing piece of research and a gripping biography. Robin Morm wrote several other books, but none that I can recommend. Instead, I would send you to his uncle for another absolutely great short, long, short read, the story Rain. If you're interested in how writers get their ideas, you could read Rain alongside Somerset Maugham's Writer's Notebook. There you can see how in 1916, but a long time before he actually wrote Rain, he was on a tour of the Pacific with his partner, Gerald Haxton. Their steamer, Sonama, was delayed by a quarantine inspection, of course, yes, quarantine boats at Pago Pago. Morm, Haxton, and the other passengers, including a Miss Thompson, who entertained men at night, took lodgings at what is now known as Sadie Thompson Inn. Morm didn't, in his story, he didn't even bother to change her name. She was Miss Thompson in life, and he put her straight into Rain. Other passengers included a medical missionary and his wife, who were the models for the characters in Rain, especially the missionary who tries to convert Miss Thompson from her wicked ways. The story has an absolutely stunning climax, unexpected, shocking. In his notebook, Morm just records 3 short descriptions, one of that, what is now the Sadie Thompson Inn, one about Miss Thompson, and one about the missionary. Underneath the description, he comes back later, editing this notebook for publication, and writes, "On these 3 notes, I constructed a story called Rain." Okay, this is probably the darkest book I'm offering you today, Hunger by Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian writer. It's also the book with the oldest publication date on my list today. Hamsun won the Nobel Prize in 1920, an amazing achievement for someone who came from peasant stock and who at the age of 19 worked as a shoemaker's and rope maker's apprentice. Hunger established his reputation. It tells the story of a starving young writer who wanders around Christiania, Oslo today. Each day is a struggle for the young man to survive, to stay alive. He scrabbles to find something to eat. He pawns his clothing. He looks for benefactors. He tries to write and sell a piece of writing. When he does acquire a little money, he makes rashly generous gestures towards others. His existence is utterly precarious. He is always at risk of losing his derelict rented room. He has to warm himself with newspaper. He is weak with hunger. Yet the strength of his passion to write and his comically absurd obsessions exert a gripping force over the reader. He has a few encounters with shopkeepers and men and women in the streets, but we are always inside his feverish and delirious head. Is he mad, we wonder, or playing at madness? We are, of course, watching the young Knut Hamsun himself, who would, as we contemporary readers know, eventually make good and never know hunger again. This quote I'm sharing with you is an example of how, despite the hunger of the title being a real physical hunger, what truly consumes the narrator is the hunger to write. If If you have ever tried to write professionally, if you've ever had great ambitions which have been thwarted by your own foolish actions and general disorganization, you'll sympathize with this. I felt capable of a much greater effort than that. I was in a fitting mood to overcome difficulties, and I decided on a treatise in 3 sections on philosophical cognition. This would, naturally, give me an opportunity of crushing pitiably some of Kant's sophistries. But on taking out my writing materials to commence work, I discovered that I no longer owned a pencil. I had forgotten it in the pawn office. My pencil was lying in my waistcoat pocket. Good Lord, how everything seems to take delight in thwarting me today. Published in 1890, this novella in many ways reads like a more modern or even a contemporary work. It's considered a milestone of publishing and sits on many syllabuses. Considered the first modern novel in Norwegian literature and a precursor of Kafka and of contemporary writers like Paul Orster. In fact, if you like Hamsun's Hunger, you might also like Paul Auster's novella Travels in the Scriptorium, about a man who wakes up in a strange room with no idea who he is. It is the exact length of a flight between Cape Town and Johannesburg. I can tell you that for a fact, if you ever have the opportunity to test that again. I should just say in passing, as we leave Hamsun and his novel Hunger, a shadow lies over Hamsun's reputation. He was an admirer of Hitler, and after the war only escaped imprisonment because he was declared not of sound mind. A Box of Matches by Nicholson Baker. Nicholson Baker, who is now 64, is a novelist with a poet's interest in small, humble things. He is the master of minutiae. Not a poet, but he has said that reading poetry taught him to write prose. And as you'll see when I show you some of his more recent books, poetry is a theme with him. He's interested in poets. A Box of Matches is marketed as a novel, which might infuriate lovers of conventional fiction who want a plot. But I feel that there are other pleasures of reading besides plot. Sometimes we want a reader to keep us company, to amuse us with sublime leaps. For example, about the sound made by train sirens, or with a nutty digression about belly lint. Sometimes we just want to live alongside a writer for a while as they follow their daily routine. The premise of A Box of Matches is this. The narrator, who is called Emmett and who edits medical textbooks, is in all other respects like Nicholson Baker himself. He has a pet duck and a pet cat. He is tall and bearded and lives in Maine. Every morning at about 4 a.m., he wakes up, lights a fire, eats an apple, makes coffee, and writes a few pages of his thoughts. Each of the 33 chapters corresponds to a match in the box Emmett uses to light the fire in the morning. When the box is empty, the book will end. He begins each chapter with a morning greeting, quite cheerful, perky, and an announcement of what time it is, as if he's just walking in and calling us awake. Does it sound boring? I found it soothing, hypnotizing, and funny. I loved Emmett's thoughts, and today, years later, since my first reading of it, I still think of the pleasure the book gave me and how much it taught me about the discipline of daily writing, how important it is as a writer to follow a train of thought to its conclusion. In the face of a world so horribly dedicated to mindless action and in which so many people lack curiosity, Baker offers the consolation of gently meandering thought and an infinite capacity to be interested. Here's an example of one of Emmett's thoughts in a box of matches. I would like to visit the factory that makes train horns and ask them how they are able to arrive at that chord of eternal mournfulness. Is it deliberately sad? Are the horns saying, be careful, stay away from this train, or it will run you over, and then people will grieve, and their grief will be as the inconsolable wail of this horn through the night. So Nicholson Baker's books are addictive, original, and funny. He's not like any other writer you'll come across. And he does go to some weird places in his and your head, but he is always accessible. I often feel that when I'm reading, I can tell what kind of person lies behind the fiction that I'm reading, and this affects the level of my pleasure. In Nicholson Baker's case, I can tell that the person behind the writing is someone I would like to hang out with. And I found some interviews with him in which he says thoroughly likable things. For example, he was asked about his greatest failings, and he said that among his greatest failings are inability to be part of the coruscating literary scene and excessive apologizing, meaningless self-deprecation. He sounds just like the late beloved Gus Ferguson. You might like to try other examples of Nicholson Baker's work. The Anthologist is about a not very successful poet, Paul Chowder, who is writing the introduction to a new anthology of poetry. And he seems to be doing it in his driveway, as far as I can remember from my reading. Traveling Sprinkler is the sequel to The Anthologist. Now Paul Chowder is trying to link up with an old love. And Vox is an erotic telephone conversation between a man and a woman who are strangers to one another. A large part of the erotica involves what the woman does with her bra strap. It made Nicholson Baker a lot of money in his 30s, which he says he lived off in his 40s, and so he started his 50s feeling poor again. My final choice for today is The Three Incestuous Sisters by Audrey Niffenegger. Audrey Niffenegger went from being an unknown artist and teacher living in a one-bedroom apartment in Chicago, struggling to pay the bills, to an overnight sensation after her first published novel, The Time Traveler's Wife, was recommended by the Richard and Judy Book Club in 2003. As is so often the case, there was another book before The Time Traveler's Wife, which publisher after publisher had rejected, often saying, "This is wonderful, but we're not going to publish it." The Three Incestuous Sisters is a picture book for grown-ups. It started life as a painstaking art project when Niffenegger was a graduate art student. She wrote the text, drew and painted the illustrations, and even made the paper by hand. The first 10 copies, handmade copies, were sold for $10,000 each. Finally, 20 years later, it came out in a beautiful, affordable hardback. I got my copy for 100 Rand from a bookshop in Woodstock. The Three Incestuous Sisters of the title are a psychoanalyst's dream. In fact, this book was recommended to me by a psychiatrist. The sisters are distinguished by their different colored hair and their different gifts. Somehow they form a single whole while also being diametrically opposed to one another. They are too insular, too over-involved with one another, to the point of trying to lock out the world. We first encounter them battening down the hatches ahead of a terrible storm. But the storm enters their lives anyway, as any analyst would tell you. It kills the old lighthouse keepers, and the sisters send for his son, Paris, who, as in the myth, makes a choice. The resulting jealousy leads to fragmentation and tragedy. Here is the image. The only text on the huge white page alongside it is Paris's choice. You may have noticed in the previous slide Niffenegger's bright red hair. In this story, the sister with the red hair is the most gifted. Niffenegger has said in an interview that her two sisters are absolutely fine about the book. Her illustrations are reminiscent of Edward Gorey and Aubrey Beardsley. They are detailed and full of a rich symbolism that you miss on the first reading. In fact, on my third reading, I was still picking up hidden figures that enriched the tale. The text, on the other hand, is often terse, caption-like, fragmentary, and the effect is to deflect the reader's attention back to the picture. Niffenegger concentrates great life events, sex, death, fear, remorse, rebirth, into powerful, explosive visual statements. The pictures blur the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, the living and the dead, and this blurring is where the hope comes from. I can't imagine any reader not being at least intrigued and a bit haunted by the book. But if you want a simple, literal, realist story, you'll be frustrated. If you want actual incest, you'll be frustrated. It's a book for adults who love fairy tales and folk tales, and for anyone who loves staring at paintings and seeing their deeper meaning. It's also for anyone who has analyzed the relationships within their close family and acknowledged both the strength and the darker side of shared intimacy and resources. Niffenegger gives a lovely history of the book's genesis and its journey to publication, which you find on the last pages of this hardcover. She will not, however, talk about what the book means. Imagine it, she says, as a silent opera featuring women with very long hair and a flying boy. So in conclusion, I'd like to end this lecture by pointing out how many of the greatest works in the canon are in fact novellas and quick reads. Probably of these that I'm showing you here, I would say The Death of Ivan Ilyich is my favorite, along with Mrs. Dalloway. But you think of The Great Gatsby, Animal Farm, The Aspern Papers, The Old Man and the Sea, not pictured here, The Little Prince, Of Mice and Men, Death in Venice. All these influential, memorable novels had fewer than 200 pages. It's as if in each case, the writer took away all the fat, all the rambling, self-indulgent overwriting, and left us with a hard, bright gem that lasts forever. If you feel you have any gaps in your knowledge of classic writers, I'd urge you to embark on a program of reading their shortest works. Very often, they're the best. Thank you. Coming out of that, and okay. Buyo, yikes. There I am. I'm just going to do this.